The situation in Europe is complicated. You see, most people don't understand that countries and territories change over time, both politically and geographically. This is especially difficult for Western Europeans to grasp, because Western Europe is very stable, for reasons I will explain. There have not been any major border changes in a very long time. France, Spain, Portugal, Great Britain, Italy have not had any significant changes, if any at all, in living memory, whereas in Eastern Europe, things have been very different. The redrawing of borders happens almost every generation. Eastern Europe would be unrecognizable less than 80 years ago. Most of present-day Poland used to be Germany. Much of Western Ukraine and Belarus were actually part of Poland. Hungary was much larger and included most of present-day Romania, not to mention the Balkans and all the countries that emerged following the breakup of Yugoslavia barely 30 years ago. The main reason for this is location. Central and Eastern Europe is vulnerable to invasion from all sides, and with no natural defenses, invading armies can more easily sweep across these vast areas such as the Great Northern European Plain. Take Poland, for example. The entire country has gone from great empire to a mere province of another empire, and when it was independent, the shape, size, and location has shifted drastically. It's only the countries on the fringes of Europe that have managed to withstand geopolitical upheaval, for the simple reason that the ocean is not a potential invader. So when a country like the Ukraine finds itself entangled in a war with a major power, most people don't understand the situation. They assume it's the same geopolitics there as it is in Western Europe. They assume the current borders have always been where they are. They assume Ukraine has always been independent, and they assume every country is, or ought to be, a Western-style democracy. The Ukraine and Russia can be compared with England and Wales. They are indeed distinct people, with their own language and culture, albeit genetically they are indistinguishable. However, they are so close that they fall under the same regional culture and have historically formed one nation together with other similar people groups. People in the UK take it for granted that Wales has not been independent for over 800 years, and no one really cares or thinks it's important. However, there has been no foreign entity which has infiltrated and subverted Wales in an attempt to destabilize and create dissent through various means. It could quite easily happen. Let's imagine the USA turned against Britain for whatever reason. Let's just say they want regime change because London is not towing the line, and some independent party managed to take power and decide to go all isolationist, meaning no more support for Israel and no more involvement in any foreign wars. The warhawks in Washington would have a meltdown as they lose one of their key allies. They would send in their agents of subversion to Scotland and Wales immediately to begin a campaign to weaken Britain and encourage the dissolution of the Union. Scotland would be easier to pinch off, as there is a stronger support for independence. All they would need to do is create anti-English sentiment by convincing people, especially the younger generation, that London is the oppressor. There has always been an undercurrent of anti-Englishness in Scotland, and to a lesser extent in Wales. Reigniting old resentment could be done, and this is exactly what they did in Ukraine. Reminding people of past events and wars would be a simple way of stirring up hatred. Now let's talk about Finland. This is an interesting case. You see, Finland was part of the Russian Empire until 1917, when Russia found itself in a civil war. As the Bolsheviks took control of Russia, the Finns found themselves in a civil war of their own, as they also fought against the Bolsheviks. Only they managed to defeat them, with the help of Germany and many foreign volunteers, including Russian. The Finnish Bolsheviks were of course supported by the Soviets, but where they were busy fighting against their own people, they could not commit enough resources to change the outcome. The only other foreign aid came from British volunteers. Interesting how Britain always likes to claim the moral high ground and assumes the self-ordained title of good guy. Well, I have a bridge to sell you. I'll be covering how Britain plays off multiple sides in international affairs and conflicts in another video. Anyway, fast forward to 1939, and Stalin is placing territorial demands on Finland, using the regular excuse of security. Finland refuses, so an invasion is launched. Finnish forces inflict huge losses despite overwhelming odds, so much so that the Soviets are forced to change tactics. But in the end, Finland couldn't keep fighting in a war of attrition with an enemy the size of the USSR, and were forced into negotiations. A treaty is signed. Large territories are ceded to the Soviet Union, albeit to great shame and embarrassment for getting BTFO'd by the Finns, who managed to save their independence and also gained respect as they emerged as a serious force to be reckoned with. Hostilities recommenced, however, in 1941, as Finland joined Nazi Germany as they invaded the Soviet Union. It's important to note that Finland was looking to regain lost territory and only participated as far as regaining this territory. With such a long border with the USSR, however, it was impossible to stay out of this fight. This became known as the Continuation War, which again saw the Soviets suffer huge losses against a smaller, weaker side, which inflicted losses at a 5-to-1 ratio. However, this was still not enough, and the outcome was much the same as the Winter War. Finland gave back the same territory and remained free of Soviet occupation, following a new treaty. Remember, the USSR was the aggressor here. It was controlled by the most despicable, murderous regime in history, and had proven to be a huge threat to Finland, and many other countries, for that matter. Therefore, calling the Finns Nazis and trying to paint them as the bad guys is pure ignorance and just plain stupid. They collaborated with the Germans out of self-preservation, as it was their only realistic chance at beating the Soviets, who presented an existential threat to them, make no mistake. After the war, the two former belligerents managed to put any bad feelings behind them and formed fairly good relations, as Finland vowed to stay neutral, which worked well for them. Despite this, Finland drifted more towards the west, but didn't join the EU until after the Soviet Union had collapsed. Now, I can't stress this enough. Russia is not the Soviet Union. So many people cannot understand this. The Soviet Union consisted of 14 countries, Russia being the largest, yes, but Russia and its traditions go back 1,000 years. The Soviets came out of Jewish Bolshevism barely 100 years ago. This was a modern ideology, born out of Freemasonry, an atheistic, secular, anti-Christian ideology. Russia is Christian, and you can't divorce the two. Communism was an attempt at stamping out the church, but ultimately it failed. However, Russia still carries the stench of Bolshevism and the atrocities it committed all over Eastern and Central Europe, from Finland to Bulgaria. Think of it as a cancer or demonic possession. Russia was sick for many decades as the forces of evil held it hostage in its own land, along with Central Asia, the Caucasus, the Baltics, and the Ukraine. This evil entity spread its tentacles deep into Central Europe, causing misery for 2 generations. Finally, in 1991, this evil died, and the shackles fell off, leaving a wounded but living Russia. Most of its former vassals, upon noticing the broken chains, ran off as far away as possible and into the arms of the West. As they looked back at their former captor with horror and disdain, all they could see was a monster as Russia struggled to find its feet, like a person climbing out of a dirty pit, still covered in mud, exhausted, and struggling to stand up, yet free. Countries like Poland still see Russia as the Soviet Union and hold them responsible for all the atrocities. Plus, you have the historic conflicts between these two nations, going back hundreds of years, so reconciliation is unlikely. Because Finland remained free of Soviet control, they were able to build relatively good relations, but there is still a lot of bad blood just beneath the surface, and all it would take is a small spark, and the Continuation War would continue once again. Putin has made it clear that Finland joining NATO is a red line, and he doesn't bluff. So when he says there will be a military response, he means it. Only this time the collective West has his attention, whereas before the invasion of Ukraine, he was ignored. If Finland joins NATO and Russia invades, all other members of NATO are obliged to respond, as they basically all have war guarantees with each other. Now, what happens on paper and what actually happens are not always the same. Here's what I think might happen. Finland might get sacrificed and left to fight on their own against the Russian bear, just like the Ukraine. They'll get plenty of weapons, but the collective West could very well abandon Finland and leave them to their fate. But Finland is also part of the EU, and the West must respond, right? Wrong. The West is now built on lies. You think the elites care about integrity and honoring some written agreement? No, it is the empire of lies, as Putin stated. They lie to everyone, they cheat and they steal. So if Finland expects to have NATO troops from the major Western powers on the ground with their own military fully committed to defending their territory, well, they need to think again. Because it looks like they're being led down the same path as the Ukraine. Now, could Finland withstand a Russian invasion on its own? The answer is yes. I believe they could, and here's why. Finland is a reasonably large country, at 338,000 square kilometers, but it also has 187,000 lakes, so the actual dry land area is considerably less, of which 75% is covered in forest. It's almost like an archipelago. You've got this mishmash of small lakes, small islands, big islands, with yet more lakes inside these islands, and long lakes, which are hard to tell apart from rivers. Looking at a map of Finland, the land looks shredded. It's so irregular and peppered with bodies of water, which means an invading army is going to find it extremely difficult to maneuver, let alone fight an enemy defending its land. So the invading tank columns are going to be very limited in where they can advance. They'll be forced to funnel themselves along narrow roads, which have forest on either side. Sure, Finland is flat, but it's not open country suitable for tanks, and crossing these various lakes and irregular bodies of water is not as simple as crossing a river, which in itself is a very challenging task. However, once a bridgehead is established, the army crosses and it's done. Finland has maintained compulsory military service and a very capable and modern air force and navy. The memories of World War II are still very much alive, so they've never allowed themselves to fall asleep at the wheel, so to speak. They've maintained military readiness ever since 1944. A modern Russo-Finnish war would be very messy and could resemble what happened in World War II. Finland's disadvantage is the size of its military. In a prolonged war, they would probably have to seek negotiations at some point, much like what happened in World War II. In conclusion, this would no doubt devolve into asymmetric warfare, as the Finns would use the irregular terrain and dense forest, which they know extremely well, to ambush and slow any Russian advance. I'd imagine they would employ the Moti tactic, as they did in World War II. This involves cutting enemy columns into smaller pieces, first by blocking both the front and the rear to prevent any further advance or retreat. Then they would pick off the radio operators to further isolate the column before going in for the kill. The Finns used this tactic to great effect and defeated Soviet formations many times larger than their own. Finland fought extremely well, and had it not been for the sheer weight of numbers of the Soviet forces, they would have ended the conflict on their terms. In short, had the odds been even, Finland would have made short work of the Soviets, pushed them back over the border, and marched on Moscow within a month. Having said that, this conflict would involve modern weapons, so predicting the outcome is difficult. I do suspect the north is where we will see the first hot contact between Russia and NATO. So either Finland will be the staging ground for a full unified NATO operation, or the West is preparing to throw Finland under the bus, as they did with Ukraine and are about to do with Poland. The Atlanticists may be looking to destroy Eastern Europe completely by maneuvering all these countries into a direct war with Russia. It would solve their problem in trying to get them to abide by their postmodern agenda, which so far they've resisted, especially Hungary and Poland, who have been a real headache for the wokesters in Brussels. Anyway, that's my take on the situation. Let me know what you think in the comments below.